Many cookbooks are solo projects, but there are also many that are collaborations or for a particular brand. If you've established a career being part of someone else's brand, how do you break out to write your own successful book? Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Andrea and I'm here today with Kate Leahy. Hey, Kate. You have worked on so many cookbooks with other people. You've also written your own. So what was it like to do that solo project?
It was really freeing. One of the things that was freeing about it is that I didn't have to suggest something, then wait for feedback, then get feedback that was a no, that's not the direction we want to go, or to be waiting for feedback from everyone like, hey, can we finalize the recipe list? Instead, all that was on me. But because of that, I had control of the timeline. And I think when you're working on a solo project, that's the freedom. I mean, the timeline is the slipperiest thing to manage when you're working with a team. But on the flip side, writing my own book gave me immense respect for you, Andrea, for all that you do on your solo books because of all the work it takes to figure out what is a recipe that belongs in this book that I'm going to develop, that's not somebody else's recipe, that I'm just making work.
Right. And it's about defining and deciding what is a meaningful recipe, right? Like something that's going to have impact for the cook and to really put together this cohesive three-dimensional thing with parameters that you set up. You're not trying to shoehorn somebody else, your idea into somebody else's ideas. I'm working on a collaboration project, but so I have immense respect for what you do, Kate. But today we've got Helen Goh coming on the show. She is based in London. She's going to discuss her debut solo project, Baking and the Meaning of Life.
How to find joy in 100 recipes. And I just have to say before we bring her on, I love this title.
Me too. It is joyful and it's very compelling. Let's bring Helen on. Helen Goh, welcome to Everything Cookbooks.
Thank you so much. It feels like a full circle moment because I listened to Everything podcast the entire time I was testing my book.
You did?
Yes,
oh my gosh.
Absolutely. It was my kitchen companion. I just found it so reassuring because sometimes that process felt like a bit alone. Sometimes I felt like I just wasn't sure what I was doing. It was just so helpful and reassuring just to have that voice and that end result that there will be a cookbook. This is a podcast full of cookbooks and there will be a cookbook very soon. So it was just very reassuring in all kinds of ways.
So that actually, segues right into one of our first questions for you, Helen, because you have been in food and hospitality for, correct me if I'm wrong, over 30 years.
That's right, yes.
So wearing so many hats, taking so many risks in your life and your career. Mm-hmm. What took you so long to get this debut book out?
I never plan things. I'm not somebody who is very ambitious and have grand plans. But what I really like to do is kind of focus what's in front of me. If somebody gives me a project, that's all I focus on. And I think there's always just been something in front of me. And I've enjoyed them. Each time something new has come up, I've enjoyed the challenge of it. And, and when you focus on something so fully, I just find that the next thing just comes out of it. I never get that period where, now I can rest. When you're very present to things, I feel like things flow from there. So the next thing just sort of always reveals itself before I have time to say, I'm going to take a break and think what I'm going to do, next 5 years. I've just never had those moments.
But finally, that moment came because books don't happen instantly.
Yes, that moment came. And I have to say it's largely because I had a publisher. I think she must have emailed me every 6 weeks for 5 years. Where are you at? Is now a good time? Is now a good time?
That was Murdoch?
Yes, that's right. And it was Jane Morrow, who's the publishing director.
Were you hesitant from the beginning, just thinking, I don't want to do my own book, or how will I make that work?
Yes, so she emailed me very shortly after Sweet came out. So that was 2017. And shortly after that, I had that first email from her. But at that time, I had already contracted with Yotam to do the second book, which in our heads was going to be a kind of a second baking book. And actually, it came about that when we were traveling for our book tour in the States, we had a great time, but every morning at the hotel or even in the evening, after an event, we would talk about what we really wanted to eat, not hotel food and not, a fancy restaurant. So we started to fantasize about this idea of the food we love. So in our heads, we were going to write this book called The Food We Love. That was going to be the second baking book, which wasn't baking. And that ended up being Comfort, which came out last year. So at the time that Jane approached me, shortly after Sweet was published, in my head, I was still very much Ottolenghi, an Ottolenghi collaborator, and I didn't feel the need, or I didn't feel like I had something very strong to say. I love the collaboration that happens at Ottolenghi, and there wasn't anything pulling me out of that. So I didn't fob her off exactly. I think I just said, I'm contracted to do another book. She said, well, when that's done, we'll... So every 6 weeks, literally, she would just, just checking in. Where are you at? How are you feeling? Anything welling up for you? And she just never let that go. And the moment when Comfort was done, I think I said, yeah, this is a time. Although that took a little bit of thinking as well, because in my mind, there are so many good baking books out there. And I thought, well, what would I contribute to that? How would I make something my own? What would it be? Actually, the penny dropped for me. It was in 2023 when there was a spate of natural disasters. And the deadliest one was an earthquake in Syria and Turkey. It was kind of organized through the grapevine, through Instagram, and we all baked a lot. And we had 2 days to bake and then to take it to this pub in North London to share, I guess, with all the bakers in London. My children and I went together and we dropped off our cakes. We were also given a box to buy cakes. And my husband, who was waiting in the car, when we got in, he said, that's just so inefficient. He's a bit of a numbers man. And he said, that's just such an inefficient way of raising money. Wouldn't it have been better if you all each gave £10, or £20? And I thought, that is so true. But yet the power of us all coming together, the power of the community and this sense of doing something that you're competent at, that is something sort of beyond yourself, in solidarity to these victims, thousands of miles away. It just felt like a very powerful thing. And so all the way home in the car, we had this discussion about why cake and why not salad? Why not roast chicken? It was just because of what it symbolized.
Right. You've said so many things that hit upon who you are as a cook, a baker, a writer, and a person. Going back a little bit to what you said, you felt so comfortable being part of the Ottolenghi organization. A lot of, our listeners are people who work for other organizations or they've collaborated on cookbooks and stuff, and it's a very comfortable position to be in. You've worked with Yotam for so many years, and in a 2017 interview with the Sydney Morning Herald's Good Food, I picked up this quote where you compared yourself to Yotam. And you said, I like to perfect classic simple things. I don't like invention for its own sake. He is less bound by the traditional. He's always saying, what can we add? We call it Ottolenghi-fying something.
Yes.
And, I've heard that, that whole thing of like, oh, it's Ottolenghi. It's like a verb. And so you change. I mean, it's obviously that you describe yourself in the new book as being impatient too. So Tell us a little bit about yourself as a cook and a baker and a person in this career and that breakout.
It's a very good question because I feel like I have evolved. There's been an evolution, let's say. And even though it seems kind of contradictory, to say that we like to perfect the classics and rather than, creating or inventing, because Ottolenghi as a brand is so synonymous with creativity and new flavors and new ways of partnering food, for example. But one thing that Yotam has always said is that he doesn't like his desserts to be too out there. I think it's because we look forward to comfort more than any other food. The dessert, it gives you that sense of the sort of finale to the dish. You want to be able to kind of rest. And I mean, that's not obviously the case all round, because you can have very, very creative desserts that are mind-blowing. But we both saw desserts as something that we didn't want anything too funky. I mean, there's nothing really funky in sweet. I mean, yes, we really wanted to hone in a particular flavor, but we didn't do anything wacky in it. We were aligned in our thinking with that. But, it's funny, doing my own book now, I think 5 years ago, I don't think I could have written this book, because I was in that Ottolenghi mind frame. And even though, as I've just said, we didn't really want wacky desserts, I feel like there is still a self-conscious feeling when you're a recipe developer for Ottolenghi, that what are you bringing to the table? You're kind of constantly asking yourself that, or how do I Ottolenghify something? And with this book, I didn't have that question. This book was very much, what did I really enjoy this past year? What did I bake for somebody that really made them happy? The questions for me when I was developing the recipes were very, very different to when I worked at Ottolenghi. And I'm not sure, if you compare the book, whether it would be that different if it was the second Ottolenghi book. I think it would be, but the questions I asked myself during and at the beginning of each recipe and during the recipe development process were very different.
Was it difficult to get Ottolenghi out of your head? Because I think when you've worked so closely with a group or with a team, there may be vocabulary or certain ingredients that just become part of your repertoire. But then again, this book is very personal. So were there ideas that you kept on the side when you worked for Ottolenghi that you knew weren't right for those books, that you were going to save them for a book of your own someday?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, there's a lot more kind of Asian twists or Asian ingredients. It wasn't that Yotam didn't like those ingredients. It just didn't seem to fit with the Ottolenghi brand. I mean, in sweet, I did do a pineapple tart, but I made it look like a mince pie, It didn't flow so well to have pandan, let's say, in an Ottolenghi book. And yet this one, it just felt totally right to bring in the matcha, the pandan, all the things that I have in my home. So I didn't really have, I think I was ready. I think actually that, by the time Jane came to me this final time, I think, yes, those ingredients were kind of bursting out of me. And I didn't have that tussle of, is this too Ottolenghi? Is this me enough? It just felt very, very natural. And I think it was that sort of reflection, first of all, from that fundraiser, coming home from that fundraiser, that was a sort of an illuminating moment that, what is baking? Why do we bake? Why was this so moving? Why was this so important for the community? So it was that. And then the realization that I've used baking to express myself in so many different contexts and for such a long time. So once I kind of realized that, it was actually quite easy to sort of look at all the events and all the things that I'd baked for. So it came about very organically, I would say, once I realized that.
Maybe like a relief that you hadn't realized you had been holding so much back. It's like freedom.
The freedom was in not having to ask yourself that question, how do you Ottolengify it? It was just about how to deliver maximum pleasure, minimum fuss. I mean, not all the recipes are unfussy, but I didn't have that burden, if you like. I mean, it wasn't a burden at all working at Ottolenghi, but I didn't have to ask myself that question.
Right. You're working within a particular set of parameters, and here the parameters are yours. And, there's a point in Baking and the Meaning of Life where you say, I can't resist mixing and matching, borrowing and lending, testing the boundaries to see what will happen if you take from one tradition and give to another. And I thought that was just like such a beautiful statement about who you are and what you practice as someone who is a creative culinarian as well as a human. It's around page 250 or something. So it's further in the book, in the ritual and tradition chapter.
Yes. Was it the pineapple
Yes.
Mamul?
Yes, the pineapple mamul. And I've made the traditional pineapple tart, the quay tart, with the, shaped in the little, like a little tangerine thing.
Yes.
And I've seen the lattice ones. I wouldn't even go there. But the mamul I thought was just brilliant. absolutely brilliant.
Well, it's interesting because in some ways, I'm nervous of people thinking, well, you're mucking around with tradition. That's not a mamul. And then on the other hand, that's not a pineapple tart. But somehow I didn't care, not because I want to offend anybody, but just because it was a process of, I really love pineapple tarts. And for the uninitiated, that biscuit, that the pastry can be just too crumbly, too rich. And often, when I make them, my Western friends they're a bit confused by it. They like it, and yet there's something they don't like. And I thought, well, I don't want that ambivalence. I want a full biscuit that everyone can enjoy. And it just gave me the idea that actually it's an encased, the whole thing is about this jam that is just so unusual by Western standards. It's almost like a caramelized pineapple jam. And it's kind of chewy in a way that you don't think of in Western jams. I thought I want to preserve that. It's so lovely. But that pastry, yes, it is, it doesn't appeal to everybody. And then I thought the date paste in mamul, there's something chewy and caramelized about that too. That gave me the idea of using that semolina pastry. And then I thought, well, hang on, what about not using the mamul mold, but a mooncake mold? So I had a lot of fun with that. And somebody recently was at a bookstore and they said, oh, do you worry about sort of cultural appropriation? And I said, no, this is about cultural appreciation in every way. I love this pineapple from the Asian culture. I love the mamul. I love the mold, and it was just kind of a development from that. It was fun for me.
Yeah. And I mean, those mamul molds, I looked at them and I thought they could be Southeast Asian wooden molds used for all different kinds of clay.
Yes.
And so I thought, it's a natural. It's so smart.
It's funny because in that photo in the book, we could have made it all with the mooncake mold, but I wanted that reference for the mamul so that instantly when you see it, you think of both mamul and Asian, and for me, the picture captured something of that process of that duality that I liked.
Both Kate and I went through the book and we picked out, some simple things to bake. And we found that the recipes worked just beautifully in our home kitchens here in California. So there's, this process called Americanization. You've had some experience with that. And so tell us.
When I signed the contract for this book, the very first thing that came to my head was to have the recipe tested in the States for the American edition. And that comes out of a trauma that I still hold when Sweet was published in America. The recipes hadn't have all been tested in an American kitchen. It was done by what we understand of how to convert Celsius to Fahrenheit, but there are all sorts of other things that are ingredients, maybe different, fan force versus conventional heat, all kinds of things. And we found out the hard way that you do need for baking recipes to be tested, in the particular country. So as the kind of trauma from Sweet having to be reissued, one of the first things I thought of when I signed the American contract for this book was to have it Americanized. And to that end, we sought out Maria Ziska, who is well known in the Bay Area for testing every single recipe and making sure that they work in a regular American kitchen. I mean, what's unusual is that Maria tested every single recipe in that book. I think commonly it's, you take a section of, some fragile bakes or ones that are maybe sensitive to temperature and different ingredients. But I really wanted to make sure for every single recipe that it worked in an American kitchen.
One of the things you said earlier in our conversation was that when you were thinking about writing a baking book, you wanted to bring something new to the table because there are so many great baking books. This book is an example of something new that you're bringing to the table. So how did you land on the organization of this book? And I think we also really need to talk about the title. I mean, this title is one of the best baking book titles I've seen. I mean, Baking and the Meaning of Life. You're like, wow. I want to know what this book is about. And if I'd never known you, I would want to know who this person is who wrote this. So just talk to us about how you landed on the structure for this book, because it's so different from everything else out there.
So the title comes from when I was studying psychology, one of my favorite textbooks. Well, actually, it was a novel by Irvin Yalom. He's a New York psychoanalyst, and he has a book called Mama and the Meaning of Life. And apart from the fact that I loved that title, it really was about how all the ordinary moments in life add up to this sort of extraordinary life. And I thought, in a way, for me, when I thought about all the ways that I try to express myself with baking, whether professionally or personally, that it wasn't trivial, that they might seem in the moment trivial and a bit kind of domestic and twee even, but altogether, when I looked at it, it was meaningful. And so the title sort of, that came to me very, very early. And then the chapters, and I think I borrowed something from my experience doing a doctorate. I did a qualitative study. It was actually about women who don't have children, but something about that process. I interviewed women and then I collated all the dialogue, and then I tried to look at broad categories of them. And only recently, I think unconsciously, that's what I did. I looked at all the moments that I'd baked, all the stories and the context around them. And what was it I was trying to capture about that moment? Or what was it about that particular bake at that time that was memorable? And then the categories, although it didn't kind of unfold as easily as I might seem to be describing right now, but once I looked into that, it wasn't difficult to see the themes. So, for example, Andrea, you were talking about the pineapple mamul. That's sort of a tradition. So this idea of rituals and traditions, I thought we express ourselves so much. We locate ourselves in time and in community with these rituals. Right now, it's all about mince pies and stir up Sunday. That's what I'm writing about right now. So rituals and traditions are so important to us, and we mark them a lot with baking. These pineapple tarts are very important. Mince pies are very important. I talk about lots of even personal traditions. There's a story of my older sister who worked as a midwife, and she was used to do the night shift over the weekend. On Saturday mornings, when she'd finish her shift, she would pass by her, actually one of my favorite bakeries, and buy these 2 shoe fly buns, which are currant buns. And she would leave them on my doorstep with the newspaper on the Saturday morning. And I would wake up to this. And that was our private tradition. So traditions don't have to be just Easter, your Colombo cake. It can be little traditions that you build, with your in a personal sense, that nobody else would know about, but it's still meaningful. So when I looked at all those moments, for me, that chapter was rituals and traditions. The easiest one was giving, receiving, and sharing, because that was, anytime you bake something, there's usually a relationship around it. And then actually, when I thought about, is there always a relationship around baking? I thought 90% of the time, yes, there is. But then there are times when I and people like me love to bake just for that sense of mastery and achievement. And that made me think, well, actually, that's another chapter, learning, growth, and achievement, because whether it's gardening or baking or, whatever it is, this feeling of doing something for your own enjoyment, for your own growth and learning and mastery, that also adds a lot of meaning. And I think a lot of bakers do that. That whole project baking is really about that. So that's how another chapter came about. So it was really sort of piece by piece. Every single bake, every single context revealed something that altogether I managed to group into these sort of 7 broad categories.
I mean, some of these bakes go back for a long time, as we mentioned. The shoe fly buns was that when you were still in Melbourne at Donovan's and you were baking?
That's right.
And that you were working these horrendous hours. And
yes,
after you were thrown into the position of being the pastry chef after the first day of working there.
That's right.
And so did you keep a notebook, a journal of these moments in your life when these bakes would pop up?
Well, no, because what I do have is a number of volumes of handwritten recipes. And I had one from my old
Ah,
cafe in Mortar and Pestle, which goes back to the 1990s, and in fact, it was an A to Z and a A to L and L to Z. And, they're all handwritten. And, the weird thing is, whenever I pick that up, I can locate myself instantly when I see and read that recipe. So because I didn't have a diary, but I had these handwritten recipes, which took me back immediately, like a song or a smell. It would locate me back to those exact moments. Or a cake I did for somebody's wedding, that cheesecake that I tried to develop from this French bakery that my sister and I worked at when we were at university. Because I'd had them all written down, it just conjured the context and the time.
sure. And our handwriting changes over time too.
Yes,
So we take a look at them. We're like, oh, I remember when I used to take notes in college and they were
yes,
like so neat. And now
that's
what's wrong with
right.
me?
Yes. I have a section written so like this sort of very Asian trained writing, because if you grew up in Asia, handwriting is a sort of subject all its own, right? And this one was like recipes copied out of Gourmet magazine. When I first learned, and I was just so fascinated by those magazines, and I would transcribe them, favorite recipes.
And that's what we all used to do before the internet took over our lives
Yeah.
and made things, wonderfully more democratic. At the same time, we lost certain things that remind us so intuitively of who we are and where we've been.
That is so true, Andrea, because now when I write, because I now write I've been writing for the Sydney Morning Herald for 7, 8 years, and I also now write for The Guardian. But I have these, documents on my computer, version 1, version 2, version 3. And actually, I can't tell the difference sort of between them. But when I used to handwrite them or annotate them sort of, by hand, I can tell from the color of the pen or a little scribble or even a mark, a stain. Oh, that was the one that was the first or the second.
This book is a genre mashup. It's a baking book, but there's also this other layer. I'm really curious about the existential philosophy that you talk about in the introduction of the book. It's the foundation of this book, essentially, the idea that life is meaningless. But from that, there's this freedom in accepting it. Can you just talk about writing that section? Because I thought it was a profound part of the introduction, and it really frames this book so well.
It came to me as a bit of a surprise, actually, because when I'd had a number of publishers call about after, so your Tom used to sort of, during our events, tell everybody, well, actually, Helen's a psychologist. And then, sort of the publishers came out of the woodwork about how we could do a mashup. And I think what they really meant was baking as therapy. That was the most obvious thing. And I think that's what I understood. And I do believe that for some people, baking is therapeutic. It's so embodied and so focused and so sensorial that it does take you out of that, white noise in your head. So even though I could see why that was appealing, I just felt that what else could you say about it except, that it's therapeutic and then there's 100 recipes. It just didn't seem to me like a concept for a book, but it was valid. And I started off my career as a psychodynamic psychotherapist. But when I moved from Melbourne to London, I had difficulty converting my Australian registration with the Psychological Society to the British. And the conversion process, it required sort of answering this 80-page manual, which I just couldn't get my head around. And the alternative was to do the doctorate. And I didn't really want to do the doctorate. It wasn't about the doctorate. It was about getting registered because I really wanted to practice. The most convenient college for me to go to was actually helmed by quite a well-known existential psychologist called Ernesto Spinelli. I didn't care where I went as long as I got my registration at the end. So I kind of, well, I went for the topiary in Regent's Park. That's really why I chose that college. So I was quite resistant to this idea of existentialism. It felt very depressing, as I say in the book, that it's sort of the concept is you're born and then you die, and what kind of a life will you make for yourself? It just felt so daunting and heavy and depressing. And it was only when I did the thesis, when I wrote that thesis and looked at how women constructed their lives, the women without children, how they thought about their lives in this very pronatalist society, that it made me think this idea of living a good life. How does one make a life? That really spoke to me. So it was right at the tail end when I'd submitted my thesis and was going to do my Viva Voce that I thought, oh, this is really quite profound and useful. So then in thinking of not baking as therapy, but baking as a meaningful or a good life, that really spoke to me. For me, baking has always been about how to enjoy a moment, how to capture a moment, how to mark a moment, with cake. Because we all eat and we celebrate, and we often celebrate with dinners and food. But I think we do mark the really important moments with cake. Probably because it's not essential. Nobody needs to eat the cake.
That's what you say, yeah.
I mean, basically, if life's meaningless, you're free to make your own meaning. And if you find meaning in cake and in getting better at baking and sharing your bakes with others, I mean, that's valid.
Exactly.
You even go into giving validity to perfecting a craft, like your perfect vanilla cupcakes. I'm going to make these perfect vanilla cupcakes, which, by the way, I was very intrigued by that recipe because you said it took you years to get this recipe right.
You know how the simplest things are the hardest to get right? So for me, the perfect vanilla cupcake is like the holy grail.
Right. I, from time to time, read something called The School of Life, which is an online UK source. They have all these interesting essays that are kind of, self-helpy, but so interestingly written. And your introductions to each chapter kind of reminded me of that.
Oh, I'm so thrilled with that because I love that London School of Life.
I mean, if you had some of the strange irony they had in there, that's kind of like a strange downer at the same time, but I totally understand.
Yes, I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah. And then there's also at the final mastery chapter, that whole kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, outlined, of that kind of final expression and liberation. And I just found that the organization of the book is quite profound in many ways. But did you have to hold back because you've obviously been trained so deeply in this field, and we could tell that you could have kept going on and on to just really, but then at the same time, as cookbook authors, we have to drill down certain things in our chapter introductions and to mention recipes and stuff. So how did you kind of balance all of that?
Well, I think there was a moment when the publisher did get the jitters because it appeared that I think, first of all, they wanted to make sure that I had 100 really good recipes. That was the kind of sine qua non. There's nothing that's going to happen unless you've got that 100 recipes. And I thought, yeah, I can do that. That's what I'm about. But then when I said, well, I want to add this extra bit because, I haven't seen this done. And actually, this is part of me. And this is what I can bring that's sort of unique to my voice. Yes, no problem. Just get the 100 recipes. But then as I was writing it, there was a lot. As you say, there was quite a lot. And then I think they were getting jittery. Are they going to have trouble selling this book now? Are we crossing genres here? Probably my first draft or second or even third had a lot more complexity and nuance in the psychological aspect. And there was a little hint that they felt that I was going into a kind of dark territory. For example, when I talk about giving, sharing, and receiving, that it all seems very light and, sort of lovely. But actually, giving and receiving can be very complicated. And I talk a little bit about that in the book, you'll see, but the original version was a lot more expanded. And I think they felt that it was not dark exactly, but just too complicated for a book on cakes, on baking. So I think you're right in sensing that perhaps some of it had been held back.
How did that make you feel?
Well, at first I was sort of, what is this? I was sort of throwing my arms about when I got this sort of little feedback. And they were done in a very sensitive way, like sort of a suggestion. And it had been mildly sort of edited. I sat on it for a bit. I was irritated that I felt that it was kind of being dumbed down. But then it helped me to think of it as try to convey something more succinctly rather than extruding the complexity of it. Get it in a more pithy way. Don't waffle on about it. And I mean, one thing that I'm slightly sort of disappointed about is that I feel that the chapter introductions, that writing looks and feels dense. And I think had I written more, the font is lighter in that for some reason. It made it harder to read. Altogether, it feels like it might be a bit of work to read it. And I think it's a shame because I worked quite hard at making it very readable. And I think if you sort of took the time, that it does all sort of come together. It does all kind of make sense as a package. But probably if I'd done any more, it might have gotten a little bit sort of a bit heavy and a bit dense, too dense.
I see. And you're already dealing with recipes that are multiple steps in certain cases, right? I mean, these are recipes that you want people to spend time with as well. So there's that balancing act.
Yes, absolutely.
The design of the book is really interesting because the chapter introductions are each marked by a lot of full bleed green backgrounds. It allows you to clearly see each chapter when the book is on its side, right? But at the same time, the very light serif typeface that was chosen makes it difficult to read.
I agree.
Is that true for the UK, Australia, and US books? They're all designed the same way?
They are, yes. I'm a bit disappointed at that because I think that it makes it look slightly more difficult than it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I'm hoping to get that changed for the next edition.
Well, excellent.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes.
I felt kind of like I was old or something. I need large type,
I had that exact feeling. And when I was reading the draft, I thought, oh, maybe it's me. It's my eyes, And I'm annoyed with myself because it did niggle at me then. And I wish I'd followed it up.
Were you looking at a screen, a PDF, or were you looking at, say, a printed page? Because I think it's hard to visualize what the end product will look like, even if you're looking at printed pages, because the paper stock is different.
Yes, it was on a PDF, actually. I did all the proofing on the PDF, yeah. Well, actually, at the end, it did come to me in pages at the final stage. But I think somehow by that stage, I was just so focused on the kind of recipes and making sure that all those little typos and, it shifted to that.
Yeah, no, well, like you said, in the next edition, in the reprint, they can do something with that.
I think so, yes. It bothers me and it would bother, I think we'll definitely look at getting that changed.
This is like your debut solo book. So I imagine that we learn our lessons.
We do.
Very
and
well.
as far as lessons to be learned, better that than recipes, right? For me, it's the most important thing. I love the pictures in it. I really love the recipes.
Yes.
So, I think that tiny complaint feels,
No, I mean, and because I ended up reading the introduction standing by a very well-lit window in my home. And it was just a joy.
Yeah. So you got to move around. You weren't at your desk,
I did.
Andrea.
I got to enjoy a certain part of my home that I don't get to in a particular new way. But other than that, both Kate and I have baked from the book.
I had leftover persimmon in the freezer from last year, so I dug that out and I made the persimmon cake yesterday. It was lovely. It's a perfect thing to bake this time of year. We talked about how the book is laid out in different buckets. And I'd imagine there were certain recipes that were harder to put in a bucket. I mean, you could see a recipe like the persimmon cake. Is this a recipe that fits into your giving and receiving chapter, or is it in the remembering and continuity chapter? How did you strike that balance? And a second question I have is, did that mean that your head note would have to do a heavy lift to prove that this recipe needed to be in that specific chapter?
That's a really good question, Kate, because the difficulty I had was that many of the recipes could belong in different categories. So it wasn't like, did it fit? It was which one does it fit better? And in fact, in my thesis, it was the same thing. You would have somebody talking, let's say it could be freedom or independence or self-expression. They're kind of broadly related and then different as well. So I think I really tried to get to the real crux of the person who I shared the cake with, and that moment, to try to really capture it. But there were some that I did have to change the head notes. I did have to kind of find the different angle of it. For me, it has to animate from real life. Writing doesn't come easily to me, and I always think of Hemingway's advice, which is always start with one true sentence. And that's always worked for me. Even for a recipe, start with one true sentence, and then, something will evolve from that. But yes, I'm trying to think of an example of when that happened. I think the one that comes to mind right now is the Lao Gan Ma chili cheese biscuits, because I've made it for two separate people. One for a girlfriend who lives in Canada, who, she always likes kind of aeroplane snacks. So that was kind of going to be in nurturing or giving, for example. And then somehow I think maybe I had too many in that chapter, and I had to think of when else do I make it. It was for my friend Ali, who likes to go camping. That was his camping snack. So it ended up fitting a bit better around that. Because, I've not made one cake just for one person. Usually it's something in my repertoire that I've made at a particular time that's memorable, rather than, this cake for this person and this bun for that person. It wasn't such a one-to-one kind of specificity.
Right. You had a wealth of human experiences.
Yes. And probably because, as you said in your introduction, Andrea, I've had a couple of decades to play with all this.
Well, I mean, the thing is that this is my naivete about you, Helen. I was like, oh, she's like, so we learn about you through the Ottolenghi brand, but in fact, you've had this extremely rich career before that, and also your psychology training. That's why I was like, Helen Goh, what took you so long,
For a long time, it was a very deliberate kind of quarantining of my two lives. I did feel like I led a bit of a double life, because I was really nervous about my patients finding out that I was a cook. I felt that maybe, I guess at that time, I didn't feel as confident as I am maybe now as a therapist. And I didn't want them to know that I had this other life where I baked rather than read books on psychology, So I kept them very, very separate, like two train tracks that were never going to meet. So I think for a long time that was quite deliberate,
How long did you practice?
Gosh, it took me 8 years to get that postgraduate degree, and then another 6 years to get the doctorate. And all the time, and the difference between a doctorate and a PhD for people who don't know, and I was one of them, I didn't know, is there's a practice component. There's a clinical component if you're doing a doctorate. So I've practiced the whole time that I was completing the doctorate. So, gosh, it's over 20 years anyway. Yeah, almost
Wow.
30, actually. Yeah.
That you were an incognito pastry chef.
You could have even done this book the opposite way, right? Where there was fewer recipes and more writing about psychology. That's really interesting. I mean, I can't imagine both of those careers. They're both so intense.
So intense, but I didn't have trouble leaving one. But in fact, it was a relief. If I've been sort of seeing patients, it was such a relief to just get into the kitchen and just put the music on and cook your heart out, And then sometimes when you're just kind of physically exhausted, it's quite nice just to kind of dwell and think and be in your head, kind of cerebral sort of space. So it fitted well with how I was and am as a person. So this book is really a kind of coming out.
Yes.
And, Andrea said a few times, what took you so long? It does feel a bit like a coming out.
Both Kate and I, when we were gearing up to chat with you today, we were like, Helen's flavor combinations, the techniques, I mean, they're brilliant. And I have this theory that we become much better cooks and recipe developers once that we're firmly in midlife. I'll just say that.
Yes.
And it becomes intuitive. We're much more confident, as you said, Helen, and it comes through so much in your work. And just to wrap up our conversation today, well, now that looking back in your career, was there anything you wish you would have done differently?
Wow, that's a tricky one. Off the top of my head, no. I feel like because I followed so closely and didn't have these wild, grand plans and ideas, I feel like I made the most of every situation that's come about, even this time, because it was very difficult to think of. I had no reason to leave Ottolenghi. I love the job. I love the people I work with. I had the freedom and that creativity. I had those relationships. And somehow the time came that it actually did feel right to do the book. So I feel like I kind of did everything to the best that I could at that time. I mean, having said that, of course, when I look back, I think there's so much more I could have done that's sort of better. But I think at that time, at that place, yeah, I don't have regrets. No.
That's the best place to be.
Yeah.
Not that I want to put any pressure on you about writing another book anytime soon, but would you ever follow this up with a home cooking book? Because the flavors in your pastry just would lend themselves so much to interesting combinations of home cooking. And those savory bakes just look so great, but no pressure.
One of the things that I really loved about the book, and also seeing the response, is also the savory baking.
Yes.
That was, I felt that sort of came in very organically when I thought about things that I'd baked. And then now I feel like, oh gosh, I could just go on and on with savory baking as well.
I'm looking at the Dutch baby and doing some fun things with that savory Dutch baby.
Well, the one that seems to have captured everybody is the puttanesca galette.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes. And that photo is beautiful.
So thank you so much for joining us today, Helen. It's just been a joy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I've loved it.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more about each episode, subscribe to our newsletter at everythingcookbooks.substack.com. Here are other ways to support the show. Go to everythingcookbooks.com and check out our totes, t-shirts, sweatshirts, and other merch. You can buy us a round of coffee. You can also leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Thank you to our editor, Abby Circatella. And until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.